Deputy Minister Vitalis, APEC colleagues, good day. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and it's good to be back at an APEC meeting. For those of you who know me, you will know that I hold APEC very dear to my heart, having attended many APEC meetings as an observer representing PECC and later when I served as Minister of Trade in Indonesia. I would like to congratulate New Zealand as host of APEC 2021, and I'm happy to be part of today's kickoff ISOM symposium. The speakers on this panel have been asked to provide the context for your work program and deliverables, and I'm happy to be on this panel with my good friends Richard and Dennis. Let me start briefly with the context. We all know that the outlook on many fronts is gloomy. We are experiencing the worst global recession since World War II, and recovery will be slow and fraught with downside risks. There will be negative socioeconomic consequences. Poverty is expected to rise for the first time since 1998, and the World Bank's most recent poverty projections suggest that by the end of 2021, there will be an additional 110 to 150 million people entering into extreme poverty, that is less than $1.90 a day. In the Asia-Pacific region, we can expect that there will be the new poor, and they will be younger, more urban, and more educated. Finally, the long-term implications of the pandemic are that there will be a likelihood of lasting damage driven by depressed investment, slower pace of human capital accumulation, weaker productivity, greater inequality, and structural headwinds. Whilst this gloomy outlook appears daunting, what will be important is for APEC economies to redouble their efforts to respond to the emergency and relief situation and start rebuilding towards recovery. We all know that a crisis is often seen to be the opportunity to do reforms and to build back better. This is going to be a continued theme in the forthcoming period. It is also time to ramp up and strengthen regional cooperation and collaboration. In my remarks today, I would like to just focus on economic and trade policies to strengthen recovery, and also I will spend a little bit of time on the opportunities for green recovery. If we start with the economic outlook and challenges of recovery, the Asia-Pacific region also has experienced recession, but we see signs of East Asia rebounding led by China. And this is not surprising given that the pandemic affected the region first, and thus they are also the first to resume economic activity. The Latin American region looks like going to a deeper recession and having a bleaker outlook. Our predictions are that growth rates could be 1% lower in East Asia for the next 10 years without meaningful reforms, and even lower for Latin America. I would like to highlight a number of trends on the trade and investment front and how it will be important to continue this the strength of trade and investment for recovery in the forthcoming period, and to undertake the reforms that are necessary. First, there are signs of recovery in trade in goods. That's the good news. Despite fears that trade and GVC disruptions from COVID would worsen the crisis, in fact, trade and GVCs have been remarkably resilient. In September, global trade was up 2.3% compared with the previous year, but growth has been uneven, with rebound being strongest in countries and regions most integrated in GVCs, such as East Asia. And we have seen that intermediate and capital goods experienced less of a drop and rebounded quicker. Second, an interesting trend is that the most recent numbers also show that the COVID-19 shock is deepening the trend towards regionalization of East Asia trade. Third, the trade in services remained down by around 20%. This is because of the sharp contraction of tourism and travel. On the other hand, the trend for trade in digitally delivered services, such as financial, business, IP charges, and telecommunications and information, are growing and positive. This indicates that increased services globalization and the increasing corporate contribution of services in global value chains will be the new sources of growth, especially for the economies which have invested in the digital connectivity infrastructure and have more open services. Fourth is the rise of protectionism that has happened in the name of ensuring sufficient supplies for one's own population. COVID-19 has and is likely to lead to a range of old and new trade measures. We saw many economies impose export restrictions to safeguard food and medical supplies. And in fact, the price of medical masks and protective clothing went up by 1,000% in April and May. Many of these restrictions have been removed and relaxed since then, and prices have come down. However, we have to anticipate the upcoming situations with vaccine production and distribution to ensure that we will have fair and equitable distribution of vaccines. Otherwise, the less developed and poorer countries who can't access will not be able to access vaccines for a much longer period than other countries. APEC economies include producers, locations for manufacturing, and the importing countries with large needs. So there's definitely room for cooperation to ensure fair and equitable allocation, because it won't just benefit the country in question, but the region as the whole. The G20 trade ministers, as you know, have come up with the principles of how one should be using emergency export restrictions, such as transparency, being measured, targeted, and time-bound. The intention was for monitoring to be done by the WTO and the self-reporting systems under the G20. But APEC can play an important role in this regard and also support these principles. Fifth, other than export restrictions in the name of emergency needs, one can also expect increased use of tariffs and non-tariff measures to protect domestic industries, the rise of the use of trade remedies, and regulatory protectionism in the name of rising aversion to health, security, and privacy risks. We need to anticipate this, manage it, how to ensure transparency, monitoring, and discipline in the use, and the ability to access WTO dispute settlement in the case of unfair use of these measures. Sixth, disruptions in the GVCs and reliance on one supplier during COVID have led to calls for self-sufficiency and even incentives for reshoring. This could lead to fragmentation of supply chains without achieving the goal of self-sufficiency or only at a high cost. What should be advocated is that resilience towards disruptions in supply chains and reliance on a few suppliers is diversification. The pattern of relocation will in turn be determined by domestic trade and policy reforms, as well as regional agreements and cooperation. Potentially, the RCEP with the more unified and more liberal rules of origin could foster greater regional value chains. Given the crucial role of trade investment for the recovery of APEC economies and the region, APEC economies need to introduce structural reforms that will ensure that regional and global value chains will continue to evolve based on efficiency, market, and resilience considerations. Policies and institutions so that new sources of growth from services and digitalization, technological development, and innovations will contribute to recovery through increased investments and productivity, and therefore remain to be very important. There is also definitely a role for APEC and regional cooperation. APEC has been premised on the principle of open trade and investment, and can and should still play an important role, whether through concerted unilateral reform efforts, collective actions, and pathways to the free trade areas of the Asia-Pacific. The CPTPP and the recently signed East Asia RCEP form important building blocks for greater economic integration, as well as the basis to undertake unilateral reforms. These agreements go beyond tariffs and non-tariff barriers and trade facilitation to include commitments that are progressive in services, investment, e-commerce, and many other new areas of trade and investment. APEC has also always played a role not just in championing reforms, but also in forming the critical mass to ensure that an open and rules-based multilateral trading system underpins a strong and durable global economic recovery. In the coming year, there is an urgent agenda for WTO reforms, starting with the dispute settlement system and restoring confidence in the multilateral trading system by progress being made on various reforms and negotiations, such as the ongoing negotiations on fisheries subsidies. And there are also other areas of reforms and progress that should be made in the short and medium term, such as agriculture and industrial subsidies, new issues to ensure the relevancy of the WTO, such as e-commerce agreement, and these will all be crucial to ensure that the WTO remains relevant and that we have a strong, open and rules-based trading system. Let me close with the Building Back Better theme. Whilst countries' policies priorities are first and foremost focus on saving lives and protecting the poor and vulnerable, after that we are focusing on improving the foundations of the economy and the opportunity to build back better in the recovery process, as well as resilience to present and future risks from climate change, pandemics, and human capital losses. The region accounts for 1/3 of the world's CO2 emission and 60% of its coal consumption. Therefore, curbing emission in the region is critical to addressing the climate change crisis. We are seeing leadership from various APEC economies with net zero targets. APEC can use its individual and collective action frameworks to provide peer pressure and confidence for countries to meet and increase their ambition of the NDCs for climate action and identify collective actions. The World Bank is working with policymakers, private sector, and other development partners on a range of innovative solutions to address climate change, like accounting for natural capital in the national accounts and integrating it into national planning, designing reforms, giving input into the reforms that are needed, and how to allocate stimulus spending to support building greener infrastructure and energy transition, including a shift from coal-based generation investments to more renewables, and also how to achieve restoration of landscapes and seascapes, which achieves the triple benefit of environment, jobs, and livelihoods for the farmers and fishermen who will, at the end, have increased yields, and for using fiscal tools such as carbon pricing and taxes. And this really is the end of my brief presentation, and I would like to just thank you for letting me share my thoughts, and the World Bank stands ready to provide any input and partnership in the endeavor to implement the APEC vision and action plans. I wish you all a productive symposium.